I was 7 years old when I moved from London to New York. I didn't understand why I had to move at the time. The only thing I knew was that my dad had been offered a once-in-a-lifetime job opportunity, something that he just couldn't turn down. And so, despite my protests, on July 18th, 2008, I moved from here to here. Looking back on it now, the age at which I moved was much more important than I once thought. I was 7 years old and my older brother was 10 years old when we moved. And I think if I'd been younger, I wouldn't have had the chance to grow overly attached to my home country, and so there would have been a more seamless transition when moving to a different country. If I'd been older, like my brother, I would have been mature enough to accept and maybe even embrace the move. But at the age of 7, I was stuck in between, old enough to be attached to my home, but not old enough to leave it behind. Before I started my first day of second grade in America, which in England we call Year 3, my parents bought me this little book called English American, American English. It was filled with translations of English words to American words. For example, what Americans call fries, in England we call chips. What Americans call chips, we call crisps. And what Americans call pants, we call trousers, and what Americans call underwear, we call pants. The purpose of the book was to help me adapt to the country quickly and fit in better at school. It had helped me understand the people around me, and if I changed the words I chose and the way I spoke, then maybe the people around me would understand me. But as soon as I started school, and essentially my whole life in America, I soon realised that changing the way I spoke was entirely unnecessary. In fact, my English accent and the English words I used actually garnered me a lot of attention that was totally unexpected to me. At my young age, I was completely naive to the fact that I stood out simply based on the way I talked. Every new person I met at school would ask me to say a certain word for them, or answer a question about being English. For a while I enjoyed the non-stop attention. I was happy to say omelette or hippopotamus, just because people liked the way it sounded coming out of my mouth. I was happy to answer questions like, "Are you still upset that you lost the revolution?" or "Do you pray to the Queen every night?" When I returned to England for the first time after my move to visit my relatives, they were surprised that I'd decided to keep my accent, as if it was a conscious choice that I'd made. My answer to that question was always the same. Why do I still have the accent? Well, because girls like it, of course. And that was my default answer for a long time. And it was true, girls did like it. And as the years went by, I became more and more aware of the fact that my accent often elevated me above most of the other guys at school. And I loved that. But with my increasing maturity, there also came insecurity. I began to think more about that question. Why did I decide to keep my accent? I never really thought about it before. I honestly didn't know that an accent was something you could lose. I did some research and I discovered that not all English people who move to America hold on to their native accent. In fact, it's really common for someone to lose their original accent and adopt the local accent of their new home. It's especially common in younger people, for example, 7-year-olds who move from London to New York. So why didn't I lose mine? I asked myself that question a lot, and all it did was prompt more difficult questions. Questions like, was I subconsciously holding on to my accent because it's the last remaining evidence of where I'm from? Was my scared 7-year-old self still clinging on to the home that he left behind, unable to embrace his new one? And this question stuck with me the most. If I'd never come to America, what would I be left with? Because when I'm in England, I don't stand out as the English guy, I'm just a guy. My accent blends in with everyone else. I just couldn't get the thought out of my head. What would my life have been like if I'd stayed in England? What would I be like without everyone around me telling me how I stand out, telling me how cool or attractive or just different my accent is? What would I be left with if I was just normal? I decided that it just wasn't okay for my defining feature in America to be something that was totally irrelevant outside of the country. I didn't want people to associate me entirely with being English anymore. I was driven by that thought of, without my accent, what do people even like about me? So I wanted to be independent from my English heritage. I wanted to be able to stand out without using it as a crutch. And so now, when girls would approach me and say how cute my accent was, or ask me to say a certain word for them, I would just laugh and say, no, sorry, I don't really do that anymore. How about we just have a normal conversation instead? I was actually pretty successful in my transition to being a more normal American teenager. I began to feel like I stood out on my own merits and not just because of my accent. I wasn't known solely as the English guy anymore. I was just a guy who happened to be English. I always wondered when I would start to feel more American English instead of English American. In 2012, I got my green card and became a permanent resident, but I didn't feel any different. By 2015, I had lived more of my life in America than in England, but I still didn't feel any different. And even in 2019, when I became a full US citizen, I still didn't feel any different. Looking back on this now, I can see why I was so confused. I'd had a total crisis of identity. When I moved to New York, I rejected everything American. I refused to call America my home. And I told myself that the move would only be temporary and that soon I would be back in my real home. And then later on, I started to reject being English and decided to focus on being a normal American teenager. And there were always these two clashing forces within me, English versus American, and it never occurred to me that I would be a lot happier if I just embraced them both. If I could tell my 7-year-old self one thing before he moved to America, it would be this. Never reject where you've come from, and never reject where you're going. I'm now 20 years old, and while I don't consider myself a grown-up yet, I think I've come a long way from where I began. For so long, I had fought with the question of, am I English American or American English? And I think I finally have an answer. It really doesn't matter, because they're both the same.